you very much for being back. And before giving the floor to the next speaker, I give the floor to Barbara, who has an important announcement to make.
No, it's not that. Well, it is very important.
Yes.
I've been approached during the break by so many people commenting on the ideas that we've been discussing. And I've also been approached by colleagues saying that I forgot to mention something really important, which is that we will have an international conference on uncertainty in risk analysis. So if you are interested in the answer to the question on communicating on uncertainties, then note down the 20th to the 22nd of February. It will be in Berlin, organized by EFSA and the German Federal Institute for Risk Assessment, BFR. So just don't forget.
Thank you very much. I would like to present you the next speaker. It's Kanan Krishnawami, and he is a professional, a journalist, public relations professional, and communicator and training communication, media skills for people at the grassroots. I would like to thank you for coming, and I would like to invite you to start talking about your presentation, Observing News Media in the Misinformation Ecosystem, the Case of Public Health Communications. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm quite honored to be here to present a project that we did in India, where we worked with journalists to actually enhance public health communications. So my talk is entitled Observing News Media in the Misinformation Ecosystem. And it's basically a case study of public health, but it has a lot of lessons for food safety risk communication as well. So what this presentation will cover is an overview of the critical appraisal skills for health reporting project that we did in India between 2014 and 2016, the results of the formative research and training offered, future directions, and contextualized recommendations. So to start off, this is something that, I mean, many of you would have seen. It's how news coverage is very random in terms of anything that is happening to anyone can actually cause any disease. So there's just a humorous take on how media reports research and public health news. So one of the things that we did was we wanted to look at how media covers public health in the context of the coverage of routine immunization, which was introduced in India in 2014, pentavalent vaccine, a 5-in-1 vaccine, and UNICEF was facing a lot of challenges in terms of communication, in terms of a lot of adverse media reporting happening. And so we thought that we should just move beyond the information deficit model, not do media workshops where we call journalists and give them information, but probably, train them to look at evidence, to look at critical appraisal. And for this, we used a very interesting tool which was developed in Australia. It was called the Media Doctor. And the tool is a 10-point checklist, which I'll show in the next slide. But it basically helps us ascertain the gaps in health reporting, promote accuracy, balance, and completeness. Then we scanned the health media landscape in India. We had FGDs with journalists. And of course, then we customized another program which is offered in Oxford. It's called the Critical Appraisal Skills Program for journalists. So this is the 10-point ratings tool that we used. This is basically for news and medical research and new technology, but we found that it works for information, health information, public health, and health policy-related news as well. So criteria is novelty of the news, easy availability, alternatives to the treatment or procedure or the program that is being discussed, avoiding public scare, evidence or science supporting the intervention, benefits and harms, costs. And there are two journalistic criteria. One is going beyond the official press release and consulting with independent sources of information. So this project, as I said, was funded by UNICEF. We were the research partner. Oxford University was the base in terms of customizing critical appraisal skills program, and the Reuters Foundation delivered the training. Initial baseline research and customization of the module was something that we undertook, and final preparation of the module was done by the Reuters Foundation. So there's something that happened in the course of 2 years, which I'll describe later. But basically what happened was, in terms of, let us say, getting journalists to cover the issue versus working with them to actually critically apprise immunization issues, I mean, the organizers, the partners felt that we needed a module which provides the information rather than the critical appraisal component. So in fact, in that respect, we actually failed with journalists. So we started with a consultation with journalists and also looked at how media covers routine immunization issues using the Media Doctor tool. So literature review, analysis of 350 media stories on immunization, FGDs in 6 states of India, and key informant interviews with stakeholders. Now the Media Doctor tool is very interesting. The technique that we use is a double reviewer method, where every story is actually reviewed by 2 independent reviewers, and then if they have a difference in terms of rating the story, it's a 10-point scale on which they rate the story, and if there's a difference, then they sit together and arrive at a consensus. So that's the method that is used. So now what did we find? We found that most of the news are event-based, they're episodic frames rather than thematic frames. Now, even event-based news, most of them are some official announcements or some campaigns that are being done. Deaths due to adverse events following immunization, they formed a bulk category of the event-based news. Only very few news actually had 2 or more sources being quoted. Most of the time it was the government source, a single source story, which we wanted to discourage so that media can talk to experts, but that is still not happening. Now, even the single source, authority means the government. So it's only the government source that is being quoted by the media. And even when they are quoting 2 or more sources, government source is predominant. So sourcing the news is a real challenge, and building the context, sourcing the news, asking the right questions. These were the 3 things that we found to be the real challenge in terms of doing right kind of health stories. So government was a key source of information, but the media did not turn to the experts for actually getting the news. The other thing was, for media doesn't make a distinction between the reports that are newly published and the reports that are published earlier. So whilst media did quote some of the experts, some of the reports, the veracity of the information was not evident. And independent sources, as I said, only 31% did that, and very few people went beyond the available media release to actually do a more investigative story. We did a consultation with journalists. They said the health reporting is different. There's a lot of dimensions and perspectives to health reporting. We don't get information in a palatable manner, and it's all jargon. We understand that health news impacts readers, and it should not be sensationalized. Too many aspects, too little time to understand complexity, different perspectives on health between those who practice and provide, who govern and consume. And of course, scientific terms and understanding research and data was seen to be important by them. What are the non-enabling aspects we found? This is very interesting because from country to country, you find a similar kind of answers to this. Health beat is low in priority. It does not help in career progression. Advent of PR is a challenge in terms of writing the right stories. No dedicated beat. So in India, you have district journalists, you have journalists based in the city and the metros, and different kinds of media, including the language media, so there is no dedicated beat there. Remuneration is linked to news published for a large number of journalists who work in Mafazal towns and villages. And so they tend to sensationalize because they want the story to be published. And of course, tight deadlines can mean that they don't get enough time for investigation. What do they want? Knowledge on health issues, find and understand data, analyze it, and use it appropriately. They do mention that we want to understand research in context, but as we found later, when we actually taught them study methods and research designs, they did not actually find it very interesting. Skills to frame good stories, they want, and multi-sourcing of evidence and ensuring completeness was mentioned as a key journalistic quality. Understanding and evaluating conflict of interest, and reporting health crisis and risk communication. In fact, we were helped in doing this FGDs by the European Health Reporting Training Project. One of the coordinators, Mr. Dr. John Lister, who actually teaches health journalism course in Coventry University. And this project actually happened 5-6 years back, and it was a very well organized project across 5 European countries. So most senior journalists acquired skills on the job from their peers and seniors. Some courses and fellowships have helped. And of course, UN agencies and other international agencies, when they organize briefings, they attend. Some journalists do mention the online courses, like the ones which are there in edX and Coursera. Now, this is very interesting because when we did the FGDs, many journalists actually questioned the motive of organizing these workshops. They said that, you're actually holding a brief for UNICEF and for the other international agencies which wanted to actually push the pentavalent vaccine into the Indian markets. And we actually struggled in answering them. So the worldview of journalists matters, where they come from and which school of thought that they subscribe to. The political leanings, most of the journalists see stories as political stories. The political leanings matter. And again, the political leanings, it depends on which school of thought you subscribe to. Either you are completely anti-market or you are completely pro-market, and therefore you bring all these biases into the reporting. The social group that the journalists belong to, journalists who are sympathetic to the advocacy agenda, social issues, they do cover these stories, but not others. And in India, and especially in the rural areas, the economic background of the journalists and monetary compulsions matter in terms of which news they cover. So what we did was, we actually did a 3-day workshop followed by a 3-month course for journalism students on critical appraisal of evidence, where we actually taught them how to appraise evidence. We taught them research designs and methodology, and how to actually read research papers and how to analyze and interpret data. For the media, we offered a 3-day workshop. The media found the workshop very research heavy, did not subscribe to the fact that journalists should read research papers. There are a lot of debate which happens in terms of whether journalists should read full research papers or not. And for us, we were told that, you provide us a summarized evidence, we will carry the story. So what happened at the end of 2 years was, UNICEF was very, very keen to get this module out. So they said that let's wait for actually creating an evidence-based approach module. And so they created a module based on information and routine immunization, some rudimentary aspects of critical thinking and inquiry, and the module was complete. But both the module as well as the media doctor training is something that we have started in Indian universities. And what we found is we need buy-in from the editors. We need to show merit in terms of marketability of the course, and longer courses needed for district journalists. And as I said, embedding courses in schools of journalism. There are lots of training approaches which were mentioned in the consultations, which we are still trying to actually follow in terms of future workshops or programs. So workshop-based training, accompanied mentoring and online guidance, weekend courses, content classes, longer-term bootcamp approaches, and actual training in the newsrooms. The one thing that we found, which editors did agree, that critical appraisal and actually journalistic investigation are very similar in nature. And So in terms of the news, production of news, you have the news gathering stage, where you need to ask the right questions to the right people. News writing, so balance is needed, and then getting the science right, and of course, not sensationalizing and not reporting things out of context, keeping the headlines, which is in consonance with the story, things like that. So these three stages were seen to akin to the critical inquiry stage, appraisal stage of asking the right questions, finding the right sources, and then looking at the generalizability of the story itself. So what we feel is, when we work with journalists, one-size-fits-all approach will not work. So we feel now that 3 levels of engagement are needed. The first level is the formative engagement, where we need to understand the context in local settings. And in retrospect, we find that, some sociological study of news production and how, the social factors, the political factors, biases interfere with news writing is something that we need to actually integrate all this into a sort of a comprehensive training approach. Of course, getting the science right is a level at which all of us work, and that is something that gets mixed response. As I said, in our case, the media students welcomed it. Some journalists who are actually advocates for health journalism welcomed it, but a broad-based approach would need a much more engaging approach for this. And of course, the third level is, how do you continue to engage with journalists in the larger context in which evidence is produced, in which news is produced? So can we create forums like this where such social, political, and cultural contexts are discussed, debated, so that, you are able to influence the process of producing news on a constant and continuous basis? So broadly, as summing up, we found that, we needed to have the training, we needed to have the advocacy with the editors, and we needed to have monitoring, feedback, and hand-holding. So we need to have a very broad-based approach. So the original thought that we had in terms of customizing the critical appraisal skills program for journalists did not work. What is working is components of the program where we have taken up the 10-point checklist, or we have taken up shorter levels of interaction in terms of, how you cover research stories, things like that. But a journalist would not like to sit in a library to actually apprise evidence. They would not like to read complete research papers. Over a period of time, they do pick up some skills of actually analyzing the research papers, but then this is not with everyone. So what I feel, or what we feel, is that the Media Doctor tool can be tweaked to develop an evidence-based tool for food safety. And the one thing that we learned from the Media Doctor exercise is that, it cannot be a one-time thing. Journalists require constant and consistent feedback, which can be done by setting up a food safety reporting watch. Now, the original Media Doctor started in Australia, and it closed down. But Gary Schweitzer at the University of Minnesota runs the healthnewsreview.org, which actually constantly reviews media stories and provides journalist feedback. He has funding for 2 years, but I'm told that in December, even that may go out of funding. So we need to find a way of constantly engaging with journalists, critically appraising the news stories, providing them the context so that, they were able to write good stories and not come to them when we have stories or we want them to cover something. So I would say that apart from, let us say, taking evidence to the journalists, we need to continuously create evidence in terms of how media is reporting these issues. And what are the cultural contexts, social contexts, which interfere with, what are the personal factors which interfere with the news production. Unless we take up this research seriously, we will not be able to actually create a mechanism, a broad-based mechanism, where we will be able to create a forum for journalists to pick the right kind of stories, pick the right kind of skills and context. So Health News Review, Media Doctor are good examples. Okay, there was one more slide. It's not appearing. Thank you very much.
Okay, I would like to open the floor for questions. There is one question here. So your research, as we understood, has been very much about the Indian situation. Do you think it can be also transposed to the European Union situation? So what kind of factors would be relevant? Or is it, you say, are the results generalizable?
So I mean, you're talking of this kind of a project?
Yes, about your research and the studies that you did.
So as I said, European Union itself funded a project of working with journalists.
Yes.
And there, you know, they found similar kind of results. Like, for example, in the UK, I'm aware that, you know, health journalism course was started in Coventry University. And it ran for 2 years. I think they found students for the first year, about 4 or 5 students, 3 students for the second year, and then they dropped. The course has gone, it's not finding any favor. So even in Europe, it had a very mixed response.
Okay. And other questions from the audience live? I still have a question here. It says, unsurprisingly, journalist values matter in the reporting. Should each article, according to you, be accompanied by a short description of the key values of the author?
The media articles?
So revealing the background of the journalist, should that be the case? Or?
I mean, it may be a good idea, but newspapers will not do it. In the sense that, you know, I mean, if you see, I mean, it's a mixture of stories that appears in the media. Probably for the special stories that appear in Sunday supplements or longer articles or features, this kind of background can be mentioned. But much of the faulty reporting is actually done by the daily reporters, whose byline, sometimes even the byline doesn't appear in the newspapers.
Okay, thank you. Other questions? If not, I would like to thank you very much, and we'll call immediately the next speaker already. We then continue with the next speaker, and that is Fabiana Zollo. Fabiana Zollo is an assistant professor in the Department of Environmental Science, Informatics and Statistics, and fellow member of the Laboratory of Data Science and Complexity, coordinated by Walter Quattroocchi. She's also research fellow at the Humanities and Social Change International Foundations in the Venice Center. So thank you very much. I would like to ask you to present to give your presentation, which is called Dealing with Digital Misinformation, a Polarized Context of Narratives and Tribes. Thank you.
Good morning. I would like to start today from I would like to start today from the words of EFSA Ambassador Samantha Power. And Samantha said, we have to find a way to break out of our echo chambers. This is quite important because we need to engage with people who disagree with us. And in this way, we can not only challenge their views, but we can also find that in the end, they might just be right. So today, just to understand the phenomenon echo chambers, I would like to take a step back and starting from the context. So we live in a hyper-connected world. Communicating all over the world is extremely easy, and is very communicating with people all over the world can be done in very rapid times. In this world, we are relying always more on the internet and on social media for our civic and our daily life. And we also observed that we also observed a real shift of paradigm as also Massimiano said before, because we passed from the old context that was formed by traditional media, where the information was mediated before reaching the public by experts, by journalists, by editors, to the current environment that is quite disintermediated, and where everyone can not only access every kind of information online, but can also produce its own information. So we don't have any more this mediation, and this information space where we are moving in is completely changing and evolving. So in such a context, the problem is that we have a lot of information that is competing for our attention, but our attention is limited. And so what we usually do to interpret the reality very rapidly and to take decisions is to apply some heuristics, so some shortcuts to interpret reality and in the end take a decision. But when, so here I'm citing a famous sculptor, Brancusi, who said, simplicity is complexity resolved. The problem is that when we are moving from the complexity to simplicity, we can have some side effects. Because we can be victim of our biases. And speaking of these biases, I want today to focus on confirmation bias. That is the human tendency to look for information and interpret this information in a way that is already current with our system of beliefs, with our worldview. And in this way, we just look for people, for like-minded people, so people that are very similar with us, that have very similar ideas to our own, and we tend to ignore dissenting information. So information that is not, that does not adhere to our worldview. And so this mechanism, of course, can have play a role in social contagion, and one of the most interesting is the one of group polarization. That's the phenomenon that manifests when like-minded people discuss together and they reinforce their shared views, and in the end, they have a more extreme position than their original one. And I also want to talk briefly about this very interesting experiment by Solomon Asch in 1955. The experiment was very simple. There were 8 participants, and only one was the real subject of the experiment. The participants had to match the line on the left card to the corresponding one on the right card. So the task was pretty simple, and there were 3 rounds. In the first 2 rounds, all the participants gave more or less the correct answers, but in the 3rd round, some of the participants who were part of the experiment gave the wrong answer. And a subject could decide to keep his decision or to change his mind. Well, while we had an error rate of 1% in the first 2 rounds, in the 3rd round we had an error rate of 37%. So this means that when we are under group pressure, also we are likely to abandon the direct evidence of our own senses. So all these mechanisms play a role in the context of misinformation, because we have to think at these biases and this mechanism, cognitive mechanism, in combination with the hyperconnected world and with the huge amount of information that we have to process every minute. So, and that's why massive digital misinformation has been placing since 2013 by World Economic Forum at the core of the geopolitical risks of our society. So you can see here in this graph that is taken by the Global Risk Report of World Economic Forum that massive digital misinformation is at the same level of terrorism, of rising religious fanatism. That's because misinformation can be dangerous because it can influence public opinion negatively and can have an impact on real world. So I'm just here giving some examples. We had the case of Jaden 15 in the US. Jaden 15 was in a military training exercise that took place in the US in the summer 2015, but the drill was perceived online by some conspiracy groups as an attempt of Obama to impose the martial law in the United States. And to the extent that the governor of Texas decided to alert the National Guard to monitor the operations of the drill. And also for the most recent case of Ebola, the World Health Organization had to restate online that all the news and hypothetical cures and remedies that were circulating online were totally unreliable. After that, 2 men had died for having drunk too much salt water. And in Italy, we had the special case of Senator Cirenga. I translated the text of this viral hoax that we had in Italy. So the hoax was about this bill introduced by Senator Cirenga in the Senate that provides for the establishment of a fund for parliamentarians in crisis that are not able to find a job in the day following the legislative term. So it's quite easy to verify the information of this hoax because, for example, the total number of senators in Italy is lower than the sum that you can do here. But indeed, the hoax went viral, and even today, lots of people are still insulting Senator Cirenga on his Facebook public page. Funny fact here is that Senator Cirenga never existed, and we don't have a Senator Cirenga in Italy. And also, if we check on the web page, on the Facebook page, you can see that it's a fictional character. So what we did to deal with misinformation and to understand more what's going on social media, we need a new approach. We need an approach, a cross-methodological approach that needs to be interdisciplinary, where we can exploit the question framing capabilities on social sciences, but we can also use the quantitative methods of computer science, of statistics, of mathematics to validate, to train mathematical models, because we have a lot of data on social media that we can use to better understand users' behavior. So what we did was to use the digital traces left by these users and to analyze users' behavior with respect to different and contrasting narratives. In our case, the two narratives that we chose are the pseudoscientific narrative and the scientific one. So the difference is that in the scientific narrative, you have all scientific information that can be easily verified. In the pseudoscientific narrative, you have the conspiracy stuff and all the alternative medicine. So we can have topics range from chemtrails to anti-GMO and so on. And so we looked at users' behavior with respect to these narratives, and we provided the empirical existence of echo chambers on Facebook, and this is the case, for example, for the Italian Facebook. So you can see that in blue you have all the users that only interact with information coming from the pseudoscience category, and in red you have all the others. So we observe a strong polarization We have these users that are immersed in these groups that are groups of polarized peoples. And indeed, these groups are called echo chambers. What we also observed is that if we go inside the conspiracy echo chamber, so the pseudoscientific echo chamber, we can see that there are four main topics, at least in Italy: the diet, food, environment, geopolitics, and health. What's interesting here is that once a user is engaged with a specific topic, then he will very likely embrace the overall corpus of the echo chamber. And what we also studied was the emotional dynamics inside these echo chambers and between these communities. And what we found is that in general we have the generation of the discussion when discussion is going on, and these users from different echo chambers, from different groups, are very rarely interacting with one another. The problem is that when they are interacting, then you can see that this discussion is just degenerating, and the sentiment of these users is going towards negative values. So what we wondered after was, okay, if this is the situation, what happens when you are trying to change their mind? So what's the reaction of users to dissenting information? In other words, is debunking effective? Is fact-checking effective? And what we studied, so here the first interesting results is that if we look at users that are interacting with debunking content, we can see that the most part of these users are coming from the scientific echo chamber, because their narratives are pretty similar, and so they are the biggest consumers of debunking information. And conspiracy, pseudoscientific users very rarely interacted with debunking content. But indeed, we also asked, okay, but for these users who are interacting with the debunking, is debunking working? And the answer is no, because what we observed is the so-called backfire effect. So we observed that these users, after interacting with debunking, they reinforced their engagement with the pseudoscientific echo chamber. And so this strong polarization is not only something that you can find with respect to misinformation topic. It's something that also going beyond misinformation and look at specific narrative, you can find we found for lots of other topics. For example, for vaccines, here you have these plots that show you the polarization of users, and you can see two main peaks on -1 and 1, they are the two echo chambers. So you can see that users are just interacting with one community or the other. This is true in the case of vaccines, this is true in the case of the Brexit, this is true in the case of the Italian constitutional referendum, this is true in the case of climate change. So it seems to be topic independent, and indeed, when we moved to a global scale and looked at news consumption on all the Anglophone news sources on Facebook, we found a very strong polarization also here. So here we had more than 376 million users, and looking at how they interacted with pages and these news sources, we observed that these users are just focusing on a set of limited pages and limited sources, and they're just polarizing in these communities. And the other interesting aspect is that if we look at these users, the more a user is active, the more is alive on the platform, the fewer are the pages that is interacting with. So we observed that news consumption is dominated by selective exposure. So we have potentially lots of information, we have a variety of sources, but in the end, we just finished to interact with a few pages that are confirming our ideas. And so our studies had some impact on the media, And for example, the Washington Post decided to close their weekly column on debunking. Also, the journalists said that indeed it started to feel a little pointless. So, the debunking as it is seems to not work. And can we do something? Can anything be done? So here I'm citing again Sunstein, and he was citing our words on Bloomberg View, and he said maybe the best solution is to promote a culture of humility and openness. And this is because what we have to do, since we observed this strong polarization that is characterizing news consumption, information diffusion on social media, what we have to do is to try to smooth this polarization and to facilitate the communication between different echo chambers and between different communities. So in this direction, what we are doing is, on one side, to work on the early detection and the early warning. So we can exploit this information that we have about users' behavior, and we can understand what topics will be likely to be subject to fake news, to misinformation in the following days. And so we can act, we know that those sensitive topics need to be communicated carefully, and so we can adapt the communication strategy to the specific topic and try to smooth the polarization around that topic. And on the other side, we will start in February 2019 with a new Horizon 2020 project, which is coordinated by Venice International University, and we are a partner of this project, and the idea is to assess and evaluate science communication on social media, but our aim is also to design new communication strategies, to understand how these communication strategies are perceived by users, and so to adapt these communication strategies in the time, to see if smoothing this polarization we can facilitate the communication, and so have also a better response from the users. And this is a list of some publications that are related to what I'm presenting today, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Would like to open the floor for questions, and please also put them live if there's. But there were first a few questions about the mechanism of reinforcement of thoughts. In fact,
Sorry, about?
Yes, sorry. There were a few questions about the mechanisms of reinforcement of thoughts. So how do we break these mechanisms when these thoughts are put by like-minded people? And also, maybe you can explore or tell us a bit if you know how these mechanisms operate in expert groups. In expert groups or hearings, for example.
In expert groups.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the mechanism, you mean the cognitive mechanism, so maybe the biases and so on.
Yes.
So these biases are common to everyone. So there are biases that are common also to us as scientists. So as Lucia was suggesting before, I believe that we just need to be aware of these biases. So we have to know that we can be victim of these biases, and so when we are also selecting information, we have to know that we are just looking for information that maybe we just like, and so maybe take a breath and understand if that information is really reliable or not. And the other question...
Well, but it's not only biases, in fact, it's also how do we break away with the fact that people have the same thoughts and they are like-minded people, so they come to the same conclusion, so they reinforce only each other.
Yeah,
how do we break away with that kind of mechanism?
Yeah, so to break that, because you have this symmetry, so we have these echo chambers, and inside the echo chambers you only have like-minded people. What we observed is that it's very difficult to interact, to let two echo chambers interact. So we have to break this mechanism. If we smooth polarization, maybe we can find a way to access the echo chambers. But to access the echo chamber, and that's why I believe debunking is not working today, is because usually debunking was using a narrative that was very similar to the scientific one, but not really close to the pseudoscientific one. So you also have to understand that you have to communicate maybe in different ways. You have to understand that those people maybe just have some fears and some reasons to believe. And this is, for example, quite true in the case of vaccines. So if you look at the case of vaccines, not only people who are not well educated are fearful of vaccines. So you just need to smooth the tone and to adjust your communication strategy to the public that you want to reach.
Yes.
Hello.
Please.
Hi. A question. So thank you for the the presentation over here.
There you.
Thanks for the presentation. Very interesting. I want to know: are you suggesting then that the mainstream media doesn't have really an effective role to play to break the echo chambers? Because so you spoke about debunking, or what role does the mainstream media have in breaking the echo chambers?
Well, no, I wasn't saying that they don't have a role, and of course we all know that fake news and all misinformation stuff also comes from mainstream media. So it's not just a matter of conspiracy guys and all those groups, but what we are doing so in this case is to collaborate with newspapers to help them to smooth this polarization in their pages, and this is an ongoing work that we are doing in Italy with Corriere della Sera, which is which is the main newspaper in Italy, where we are just testing different communication strategies and help also journalists to deal with this kind of issues and this kind of problems. But this is something that we have to test some strategies. We have to evaluate the response of users and see if these strategies are working or not, and then we can refine the strategies and understand that that's not the way to solve the situation.
Okay, thank you. There was another question. That's the last question. Yes, please.
Thank
Can you send
Sept
up?
Hadzopoulou,
Yes.
Roskilde University in Denmark. I have a methodological question in relation to how you collected your data, because you did kind of social network analysis. And
Yes.
one of the problems in social network analysis is where you start and where you end. So how did you choose where you stopped selecting Facebook data?
Pages. Yeah,
Yes.
okay.
And the next question is, do you think that the like that you see on the Facebook indicates necessarily similar beliefs? Because you might like someone because of his social status or because of a strategy. So what does really like tell us?
Okay.
Thank you.
So, as for the data, I showed today some plots mainly from Facebook, but we also had some data from other social networks, but I'm talking for Facebook, okay? So for Facebook, we collected data only from Facebook public pages. So we didn't access groups because you cannot access groups via the Facebook APIs. So we used the official Facebook APIs to collect public data from public pages. And so usually what we did was to look for all the pages that are covering the theme for that language. Okay? So for example, in the case of scientific information and pseudoscientific, we had also the collaboration of very active debunking groups that helped us to map all the conspiracy and alternative Facebook pages, and because of course for the scientific one it's quite it's easier. So so the aim was to take everything, okay? And then we selected a temporal a time span, but usually these data sets goes at least we have 5 years of data or even more, and you have all the data about these users on those pages because we cannot access users' profiles on those pages in overall the entire time span. And so we hope that we took everything, you know, at least that's to at least reduce the bias, the selection bias. And for the like, it can be true, but generally speaking, you know, since we have lots of users and we have lots of data, we can rely on statistical significance. So even if sometimes the like does not mean exactly a coincidence of the word views, but we can assume with statistical significance that the like can work. Also because it's the only thing that we have. So you can use the likes, we can also use the comments, you can use the shares. For the comments, the meaning can be even more, yeah, we also did content analysis, yeah, and sentiment analysis on these comments, so.
Much.
Thank you.
Okay. So we have now arrived at the panel discussion. I would like to invite all speakers to come to the stage and have a seat. And I would also like to introduce you to Tracy Brown. She is the moderator of this discussion, and she is the director of science and, so has Sense About Science. And she has been having a long experience in this area. So I would like to introduce you to the moderator, and also, in fact, we're going to try to get more about the challenges, in fact, and hopefully also some solutions and answers to that. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ellen. Let's do that. Let's actually talk a bit more realistically about some of the things that you've heard just there. Because there is a danger, isn't there, that we can get ourselves really wound up about the social psychology of something as basic as having a normal conversation with people about the stuff we're working on. So I'd really like to know, first of all, kind of what level of engagement people have experienced. Could you raise your hand if you have, through work, through professional outreach or anything of that nature, if you have tried to talk to people about understanding the science in your area? Can you just raise your hand if you've done that in some sort of professional setting? Right. Can you raise your hand if at Christmas or on holiday or a wedding you've ended up in a debate with your brother-in-law or some member of your family about what it is that you do, or the diet that they're following, or some issue of public health? Raise your hand if you've ended up in that discussion. Okay. And did you find in the second discussion that you spoke in this language called human? Yeah? Human. It's a lot more human language. So let's think about those issues a bit as we develop this session. What I'd really like to hear from you is, earlier on in our poll, 23% of you said that the issues are already distorted or polarized, and that's kind of a barrier to having the kind of conversation you want. So who thought that from their experience earlier? Are you willing to just tell us something about where you think that's a problem? Anyone willing to tell us a bit about? Yeah?
I'll try. I mean, when I try and explain that I'm doing ecotoxicology and looking at the effects of chemicals in the environment, then from my immediate circle of family, I get the reaction, well, why are there even any chemicals in the environment, and why are you supporting even the production of chemicals in the environment. It's all very extreme. And it then becomes that you find yourself defending your work all the time, while I believe that I'm doing something very valuable. Yeah. Just as kind of an extreme example.
Okay, no, well, I think that's probably quite a common. Anyone else had a similar example around chemicals? There was other hands over here. Was that about chemicals or similar? Yeah? Yeah.
Well, I'm dealing with pesticides regulation, and indeed have a very similar experience on that case.
Yeah. Okay. In personal and professional?
Professional.
Okay. Other issues that people think are polarized or they find particularly difficult to talk about? Who else come on, who else? Question, we've got one down here, okay.
Hi. As a scientist, I always worked in food, and because we all eat, every single person we talk to have the scientific experience of their personal experience, and as discussed, it's an emotional conversation rather than a factual conversation. So there's no because everybody has a personal experience.
Right, okay, so food is a big cultural thing, obviously, as well. Other subjects, come on, it's not just pesticides, we've got one up here.
Nutrition, I find that is often so carbs, fats, protein. I think that's often a cause for big debate. Including, yeah, that's one of the causes, the fad diets, yeah.
Fad diets. Sorry, no one can hear me when I'm talking off the mic. Fad diets are a big issue there.
Okay. Thank you. Regarding food contaminants, people sometimes react, they say, why are you poisoning us? And on the other hand, they say, why are you overreacting? Like acrylamide, a natural toxin, why are you overreacting in this area?
Why are you
The
overreacting?
risk assessors or the authorities are overreacting, and on the other hand, they are poisoning. Right. So that's the reaction of the people.
Okay, that's a really good point, yeah? So it's you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. So you're a nanny state, bothering, rule-driven organisation if you're interfering, but if you're not interfering, then you're causing people to be exposed to risks they don't want to be exposed to. Any other subjects here? Or have we covered most? We've got more coming on, okay.
Hi, so I work in the agrochemical industry, so I would need to count when I don't end up in such a discussion at dinner. And what helps me though is to think, how do I respond to topics that are not so much at heart to me? You know, because I think what happens is people start with their belief. Yeah, and my cousin works in the tobacco industry, and then I take a very different position because I'm fundamentally against it. You know, or when we talk, you can compare it to talking about religion. You know, how do you put religion and science together? So I think this is the key issue, trying to discuss with science against or about something that is set on beliefs is very difficult. And I think we need to take a different approach to that.
So that's actually quite similar as an experience to what we heard over here, which is that when you start talking to people, you have to start peeling back, you know, whole sets of assumptions to try and sort of distinguish those things which science can answer and those things which are values judgments, for example. There was another comment over here.
Yeah, I work for the food industry, and one topic among many that I find very difficult for us as an industry to talk about is food packaging. Like bisphenol A, all kinds of things related to packaging. And despite the expertise that is there in the companies and in industry federations, just the mere fact of being in the industry disqualifies us in very large groups from even, you know, being a source of information in these matters, which is really difficult.
Okay. So, Massimiliano, I want to bring you in here because earlier on you commented something that made me really think. There's been this big push for everyone should engage and we should all put Mentos in a Coke bottle and make everyone say wow about science, right? But what you're hearing is that when you start with what the public's asking about and then try and feed that as an expert, it's a different set of assumptions. And isn't it strange that there's so little attention on how to do that? So much on discussing the broad psychology, so much on providing entertainment on a Saturday morning around the labs, but far less on that.
agree. Maybe one of the reasons is that I think in many cases institutions are preaching engagement and science in society dialogue while they're still practicing what we call the deficit model. Deficit model, very simply, it's something that was criticized and empirically shown to be completely misleading since the mid-80s. But deficit model is about, I tell you the science, and because I tell you the science, you have to believe it and behave accordingly. Now, this simply doesn't work. It has been shown not to work for a number of reasons, which I could briefly summarize. So I agree. I mean, there's this third mission push, this going direct to consumer, has a lot of ambiguities. Of course, there are many things or activities in science communication which are well designed. Very seldom they are properly evaluated. Very seldom the goals are clearly stated to the audience, for example. So I guess there's a lot of work to be done.
Okay, but an awful lot of effort going into something that maybe has minimal contribution to this area. Ragnar, did you want to say something on this?
Yes, please. I think we should be more optimistic. I know it's a bit polarized. I know it can be difficult, but please keep your heads high. The reason why I say that is that in 2011, I did a review for the UK government on health and safety. Can I tell a story, Tracy?
Very quickly.
Very briefly. Fine. Okay.
Yeah.
So in 2011, I did a review on health and safety for the UK government. Health and safety in the UK is very polarized. The Conservatives want to axe health and safety, and the Labour Party wants to basically increase health and safety. When I was asked by Minister Chris Grayling of Employment at the time, he wanted to have a political review. He wanted to axe the UK health and safety executive. He wanted to cut back a ton of laws, and he wanted to be really gruesome and mean. And I said to Chris, if you want me to do the review, I'm not going to give you a political review. I'll give you a science review. I'll have a challenge panel of people from the trade unions, people from industry, people from the various political parties, and I'll work with them. But it will be science-led and science-driven. And yes, I got a lot of flack and went on for 7 months. But in the end of the day, I put forward 24 recommendations, all science-based, and they were all accepted by the UK government, including, my friends, engaging more with Europe and not less. So it does work. Keep your heads high. Science will and always will remain important.
Good. On that positive message, everyone who was raising their hands earlier, can you put your hands up if you feel that you've had a positive experience of talking to people? Good. Are you willing to share? Can you share some positive experiences?
Yes, I think especially when you're a scientist and that you're able to explain science to people who don't understand, it's quite positive because it helps people depolarize the debate, understand the point of view of the other.
And so you experienced somebody finding use in what you said in terms of developing it into their own thinking?
I think so. I'm working for an environmental NGO, and I think that we always have to understand the point of view of the other party. And so I work on pesticides and also explain why pesticides were so much used and why nowadays, with the science we have, we can reduce the use, but also explain that pesticide companies, people working for pesticide companies, are not all corrupted people. And I think it helps depolarizing the debate and making it more scientific.
Great. Okay. And I saw from the UK here, from the Food Standards Agency.
Hello, I'll be talking about this at length later, so I'll keep it brief. I have many tremendous experiences in food science. It is my job, and I think it is our duty also as a regulator to understand and have dialogue with the communities that we serve. And one thing that's great about this conference is just how strongly that has been emphasised. I think, it's too much of an echo chamber otherwise.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, can anyone give me a very specific example of where they've said something and someone's changed their minds?
Yeah, Les Fairbank. So I led the UK farm scale evaluations, and we had over 200, I'm not sure the exact number, but we had over 200 separate meetings with the public around the country. they were all carefully designed. So in all cases, we had the scientists, policy people, we had someone from the industry and someone from an NGO. But critically, we were never there to change people's mind. We were simply there to explain what we were doing and why. And we had our audience ranging from about 5 people to 200-300. And the typical feedback was afterwards, thank you for that, we now understand what you're trying to achieve. And that was the end.
Lucia, can I bring you in on this? Because somebody asked a question earlier about manipulation. And it seems to me that there's a world of difference between asking, what does a scientist bring to the party of making my decision, and you insisting on some respect for a factual base, and actually deciding to make that decision for me, which I think sometimes these two things are being confused, aren't they?
Yes, they are. I think one profession that is actually really missing, and increasingly also missing in public discourse, is the science journalist. I mean, that has to do with economics, because many of the good newspapers and broadcasters, they're not paid anymore. I mean, it's not, obviously, not a good deal anymore. So I went to those conferences of science journalists for many years, and these days they're almost, I mean, it's a shrinking, it's like an endangered species. Those people have been so important as a mediator in this increasingly unmediated world, and I mean, on the one hand, you can deplore it, yes, I do. On the other hand, you can ask, what can you do? I mean, who could step in? And that's the tougher question. I'm thinking of, just for instance, I'm a member of the board of it's a German institution, Stiftung Warentest, which is something like Witch in the UK or Que Choisir in France. So an independent product testing organization. We just edited a book on the myths, like the 100 myths of healthy food, or healthy lifestyles. And in a very simple way, kind of noted down on one-pagers, what's the evidence, and then a journalist actually wrote it. So it's an independent, impartial sender, kind of an honest broker. So those type of organizations might possibly step in. And maybe, can I have one more comment on the earlier discussion?
Yeah.
One sentence. I think a very nice thing, I was also asked how to de-bias people. That's how I try to de-bias myself and try to get myself out of echo chambers, because of course I'm also in echo chambers, is, for instance, the New York Times, they do offer that in your news feed you also get news from kind of opposing, I mean, not friendly, not politically aligned media news, and they're in your news feed. And that does help, because you get exposed. I mean, expose yourself. The exposure effect is a first, and allow yourself in an easy way and nudge yourself to get exposed to other opinions and to other interpretation of facts.
Okay, I do wonder, when you say that about the science correspondents, whether what happened when the science correspondents were more prominent is everyone in this room and people like you felt better, but actually it made not a jot of difference to most people in society. I mean, I fight in combat sports, and I can tell you now that the decline of the science correspondent has made not 1 ounce of difference to anyone I interact with in that world, because they didn't read those newspapers to start with, and they don't read them now. I feel like the feel-good effect that we had of having a warm, appreciative audience and mediators around this kind of milieu has perhaps gone away. But whether it makes any difference to people's consumption of information in mass society would be an interesting question, which I'll come to you on, Kanan. I thought maybe some of your description was perhaps quite idealistic about how we would all love people to get their health news, but in reality it's through many more informal channels, and always has been.
No, I agree. The decline of science journalism and everyone writing about news which impinges on science, health, both have happened parallelly. And misinformation is more spread by the reporters. I mean, even if you look at the work that is being done by the American Association of Science Journalists or Health Journalists, they are trying to correct the misinformation that comes through reporters who are employed by the general newsrooms. So while we do agree that, I mean, science journalists may take a more in-depth view of things, but the misinformation is actually happening across the board. So how do you correct that? And I would feel that, it's also because we need to look at the model that we are promoting. Most of the time, it's try to understand me kind of a model. It's an advocacy kind of a model. Whereas, engagement requires different sets of rules. We need to set the rules of the game very differently. Do we really care about the other? Do we really care about how the constraints in which journalism is being practiced, the barriers to good journalism? And can we actually play a role? I know that Media Development Fund has actually shrunk considerably, and organizations would like to have quick results. They have moved away from a fellowship approach to a kind of a slow result approach. We are talking of thinking fast, thinking slow, but everybody wants quick results.
Okay, so I think we're agreed that we want people to ask the right kind of questions, whether they're journalists or members of the public, and maybe that's where we set the aspiration. Massimiliano, I'll come back to you in just a minute. Are there any questions around particularly this issue of distortion or media portrayal? I mean, any questions for the panel or issues that people want to raise that we haven't covered yet? Yep.
I have a question about the use of language, because sometimes as scientists we are really bound to our facts and we really, really care about accuracy, and that of course is very important, but then sometimes fake news uses a different kind of language. I was wondering if you had any comments on our different language use.
Okay, I'm going to hold that question. We're going to come back to that. Any other questions about, do people feel really worried about how the media might portray the issues they work on? I mean, we've talked about the new media and social media, but presumably people are still concerned about how the media portrays things. No? Everyone's happy? You don't mind the science correspondence gone? I'll come back. Okay, let's talk about language then. Fabiana, do you want to say something about this?
We don't have any studies about languages, but that's something that we want to address. Because of course languages are related to the narrative, and that's also what I was suggesting before. If you, when you're trying to fact-checking something, you're using the languages of your communities, or your own communities, and you're not trying to match also the language and the narrative of other communities. Maybe, yeah, your articles won't be read by those users. And so you have to adjust that. But of course, the language is quite important. It's also not really easy to automatic analyze languages. So we have some tools in some machine learning, artificial intelligence tools that can help in that, but you have to be quite careful. But indeed, it's something that we want to address.
Okay, who is it who said the thing about chemicals earlier down here? So presumably, there's a really fundamental issue there about talking about two different subjects when we talk about chemicals and what we mean by chemicals, as in chemicals are everywhere, or we mean man-made chemicals that are applied to our foods or our crops. So that's presumably quite a big bridge for you to get over in terms of language and understanding of concept, isn't it, when you're talking to people about what is a chemical?
Well, what I usually end up doing is explaining how we can't just change to a chemical-free environment from one day to the next, and that it's, it would be great if the agricultural system were perhaps changed in the course of time, but that currently we need a certain level of pesticides to feed the world population, and when you start explaining it like that, then people start saying, well, I guess you're kind of right. But there's that immediate, I don't want to be talking about chemicals. I don't want to be dealing with chemicals. That feeling, yeah.
Okay. Massimiliano, did you want to say something on this? Or
I think, of course, these studies and experiences are very interesting. I wonder with the fake news and debunking things, not barking up the wrong tree. Because I have the impression, first of all, I agree with the question which was raised before, and I don't think we haven't answered that. What does it mean if you like? Does it mean you when it's a question of deciding whether to vaccinate your child? I think should be careful with that.
Okay.
For example, in Italy, the percentage of people who use the social media as a basis of information to take decisions about vaccination is 4%.
Yeah.
Of course, these people are very vocal, so it's easy to overestimate them.
Yeah.
This is one of the reasons. Can I just add, the problem is that this kind of communication police that we are trying to implement to chase fake news, it's simply impractical and impossible. I was in China last week at the Conference of Science Culture. The government launched a law to punish people who spread fake news, pseudoscience, these sort of things. Guess what? They never applied. Because it's very difficult, even in that sort of regime, to decide. For example, of course we could agree on a number of issues between the border between science and pseudoscience, but on many themes, this becomes more gray. Yeah. If you had judged gravity waves research in the early 70s, that was considered pseudoscience. Now they got the Nobel Prize. So I think we should be very, very careful, especially in democracy, about who gets to decide what is pseudoscience and what is fake news.
That is such a good point, isn't it? I mean, I don't know what scares me more, the thought of fake news or the thought of the research community deciding what I should read. And I'm pretty sure it's the latter. Ragnar, we were talking earlier about Catherine Fieschi, and this point was just made about how trivial it is that we could look at people liking stuff on Facebook or making comments and so on, but that doesn't represent real engagement. And there's a danger that we perhaps look at that and think, well, everybody hates me, or everyone hates my research. And in fact, it doesn't mean that at all.
A couple of comments here. We need to engage with society much more than we have done in the past, firstly. With regard to the media, for example, we should be working with the media rather than against them. They need all the help they can get. As we heard before, the scientific journalist is an endangered species. And by working with them, we help them get the story right. One case in point, I speak to the BBC News folks about once a quarter. A few years ago, I got a phone call from the 10 o'clock editor, 10 o'clock evening news, and saying, Professor, do you know if chemical X is dangerous or not? I said, well, I'm not a clue. I'm a humble Swedish risk communication guy, but give me 2 hours and I'll find out. I made a few phone calls, and then I went back to the editor and said, no, chemical X is not dangerous, but don't talk to me. Speak to so-and-so, former winner of the Nobel Prize in chemistry. What happened then? The story died. It disappeared because basically we got the science, the facts out there. So we need to basically engage with them. Of course, the problem we have, Tracy, is that many news outlets do not want to engage with science. And I'm sorry to say, Daily Mail here is guilty as charged. I met a journalist at Daily Mail a few years ago, and she told me over far too many glasses of wine that basically she has in her contract that she's to have 2 scare stories a month. That I find absolutely frightening. On a final point on engagement, a final point, Tracy, on engagement, and I'll stop after that, is that we basically need to speak to industry, need to speak to civil societies, and we need to speak with regulators on the issues that we care and are concerned about. Case in point is tree sapling planting. In one case, give me 2 minutes. Tree sapling
Not
planting.
2, Ragnar, just 30 seconds.
Okay, so I have planted in my life 97,000 spruce trees in Sweden. My first tree I planted when I was 5 was covered basically in DDT to get rid of insects. Now over time, because of feedback from lumberjacks like myself and others here in the room, what has happened in Sweden, we have moved on because we've had this deliberation and participation. These days, spruce saplings in Sweden are basically dipped in biosustainable glue and then rolled in called sand. And as a result, those trees are safe. Even my daughters can plant them.
Okay, good. Right, we're going to start running out of time quite soon. I want to see a show of hands for other questions. I know that Barbara's indicating to me that she's got something up the front there, but anybody else haven't covered or issues that... Okay, I'll just log that for now. Do you want to bring in the question, or are you looking at someone down here?
Looking at what was submitted, and there is a question about whether we're missing the empowerment step. So I acknowledge that we've been talking about preaching engagement versus practicing the deficit model, but is engagement and empowerment the same thing, and that we're missing that?
That's a really good question. Okay, that kind of comes back to the whole point about manipulation. I'll come back to you in just a moment. I'm going to come back here. Can I also just take a show of hands? Who thinks that the social media, from a sort of professional standpoint, or someone who wants to get across science and a reasonable evidence base, who thinks social media is a positive thing to do that? Who thinks it's a tool?
Oh, I know.
Overall, it's good, no? Okay, who thinks it's actually creating more problems? Is it creating more problems in the... Okay, this is kind of lukewarm, isn't it? Because one would have thought that if your frustration as a scientist or scientific community for the last goodness knows how many years has been that you can't get past the tabloid newspapers and the sensational stories, one would have thought you'd be quite positive about the idea that there were other ways of getting in touch with people. So it's kind of interesting that everyone's a bit wary about this. Okay.
My name is Raymond O'Rourke. I'm the Vice Chair of the Management Board of EFSA. And I can certainly tell you in my time on the Management Board, and Barbara will know this is one of the big issues we have to discuss, even though we're a scientific risk assessment body. And I'm just wondering, maybe Ragnar or one of the others, you can spend a lot of time on this, and other people over there, either scientists or politicians, say, what are you spending all this time on? This is rubbish. Rubbish. Don't deal with it. And really, what's the justification for us as an authority to be getting involved in this, to engage in that? I believe in it, but I want some of the panel members to give me just a line. Why should we be doing it?
I actually think we're going to finish on that question, okay? So let's just find out a bit more. Who doesn't get enough time to do the amount of engagement that they should be doing in their research? As I've already heard from you. Anyone else not get enough time? Or you get tons of time, you can go out and talk to everybody that you need to talk to?
So I'm just coming at it from a GMO perspective, and it's really incumbent on the researchers themselves to get out and engage. Like some organizations will support, some maybe not support as much because they feel that any negative in inverted commas press is going to be bad for the organization. But from our experience, you have to get past that. I work for a public research agency in Ireland. We've done GMO field trials, and we heard it mentioned a little bit in the last few days, but contextualization is key to improving understanding. It's not about trying to make people or convince people of one way or the other, but you bring them to their decision making by showing them what would be the alternative if we don't have these technologies. And then from a position of information, people are then able to understand. But it's really important for public scientists to engage much more. And one last point, for us, we see it's actually the role of the funding agency. In too many grant proposals, you'll see the task for communication will be number 8 or 9. The communication must start at the start of the project.
Right. I want to ask a bit more from you. What kind of forums have you been out talking?
Every type, from ones in people's kitchens, from 3 or 4 people, to ones with public fora with maybe 1,000 people or more. Some of them were very hostile. You could feel the negative tension when you walked into the room. But the important thing is in the first 3 or 4 minutes is words such as empathy and humility are some things that we maybe don't talk enough about in the scientific community. But for engagement, that's what you really have to start with.
Okay. And finally, I'm going to ask you a really loaded question, which is would you say that there was perhaps no other way of learning how to deal with that than actually doing it? Can you sit in a classroom and be taught that stuff about how to go out and engage, or does the experience really teach you that stuff?
Yeah, so what happens now is we do undergraduate training, and we try and explain our experiences, but with anything in life, you only learn from experience. And if I look back retrospectively on our first public event, I would look back with embarrassment, because I walked in kind of, we're scientists, trust us, we know what we're talking about. And that's a complete failure. You can't start there.
I think that's a really good note to start bringing it back to the panel. Any other comments or points? Okay, I'm going to come down the front here.
Thank you. I just would like to start by saying there's been discussion about post-truth, post-factual society. The most useful explanation I heard of it was we've moved from being a deferential society to a referential society. And so I think much as scientists, we like to tell people the clever facts we've learned. actually, if I've got a clever fact, it's probably much more effective if that's communicated locally in a language, in a context that makes sense. So I work with infectious diseases, and we make increasing use of the fact that still primary care doctors are still trusted sources of advice. So the messages we want to deliver, we deliver through them, not through going to national media, not through big national statements. So I'm just wondering whether actually we're missing the point here to talk about what we as scientists, how we can engage. I can't engage personally with 500 million people in Europe, or 50 million people, or 60 million people in the UK. We need the conduits for that. And actually, for purely medical issues, then we have a ready-made conduit. But I think for some of the other issues, particularly ones we're talking about today, what are the conduits? And I'd be really interested to know what the panel think is the way to get into those local communities. So social media, yes, it can be really powerful, but it's not when Professor X puts out a tweet or something on Facebook. It's when someone in an individual's reference group does it. Then they'll listen to it.
Okay, you definitely come into my session this afternoon. This is really important. Panel, very briefly, please, your comments. Really, it's about support, isn't it? It's about, is there enough support for doing this? And is it directed in the right places? I.e., are we sort of saying this generic, go out there and just deal with the world to the whole of science? Or should we be actually supporting some more targeted kinds of approaches and initiatives and more community-based activities? So I'd be really interested in hearing what you say about the level of support. Please, you just have 30 seconds each. And I'm going to start with Lucia. No, I'm going to start with Ragnar, and we're going to go this way and finish with Lucia, so you get the last of it. Very briefly, please, Ragnar.
Sorry, this is difficult, Tracy. So basically, if EFSA does not engage, someone else will. You don't want to have an information vacuum. You want to fill that information vacuum. Secondly, with my last post points, I fully agree with him. And we should also involve more neutral third parties. Case in point, Austria is trying to site a waste incinerator in Vienna. And Austrians don't like incinerators. What they do, they basically involved a very trusted individual, namely the painter Hundertwasser. The incinerator in Vienna now is a tourist attraction.
As Ragnar, I am optimistic. I think that the fact that we are here to discuss this today at EFSA, it's a very good sign. I think we should look at engagement on a broader scale. For example, can I ask a question to the audience? How many of you, the breakdown of research money in Europe, where does the money go? Raise your hands. All the science festival, all science, nobody knows, not even the scientists. So I think when we talk about the culture of science, we shouldn't only talk about the scientific content of the society. There should be more engagement, because at least in democratic societies. So I think we should think in engagement in a very positive, but in a very broader way, not just about the content of science, which of course is very, very important.
Two beautiful, clear points. Let's keep to the half a minute.
So I think we need to reduce the dichotomy between the compulsions of a result-based communications approach and a knowledge-based communications approach. And secondly, community engagement using various art forms, various theater forms, comics and other things definitely go towards a long way to popularize science.
Okay.
Yeah, I need that, I believe that we need to engage in social media also because, you know, if you're not present there and only, for example, pseudoscientific groups are present, they maybe just seem to be so many because you aren't there, okay, to challenge at least their views. And what we also need is to create some synergies and collaborations between journalists, between researchers, because they can work together and we can work together to improve communication. But we need also the support of platforms, because in this kind of issues, also knowing what's going on, for example, in their algorithms, can facilitate our analysis of this data. So we can exploit this data and we need their help to do this.
Thank you, Fabiana. Lucia.
I'm closing with a very practical advice to younger researchers. I think that was part of the debate that just started on there. I think beyond the individual and your own group, try to collect, to connect to other groups of allies, but also enemies. Like there's those councils, there's in all the different scientific groups, there is You know, there's the debating culture. Maybe you can get elected to one of those policy consulting councils as early as possible. These are very good fora to test your ideas, to be able to get your elevator talk. I mean, I do think that every researcher should be able to explain what he or she does in 3 to 5 minutes, even that's to the language question, without compromising on facts or the scientific base of those 3 minutes. So test and challenge yourself very early already in your career. That helps you educate and open up and help sharpen your own view and evidence.
Right, so that speaks to the engagement, perhaps not to the broader empowerment agenda we're going to talk about this afternoon. I think that panel has done a fabulous job of setting us up for this afternoon's discussion. And Ellen and Barbara, hand over to you. Thank you.
I will hand over to, yes, of course. Thank you so much. Thank you. This was a good example of engagement, I would say. So thank you very much. I would like to hand over to Barbara for the concluding remarks.
So I would like to invite Tracy to come and take my seat while I close the session. So we're all up here, the big team that worked together to really express some of the most recent studies and data analysis on communication of science. The challenges, but also the opportunities that we face as a scientific community. And while I say a couple of words just to try and give you some takeaways from the morning, I'd like you to get your phones out again, because there's going to be one last round of polling for the morning, so we're all ready to go with that. Unfortunately, I have no time to summarize the really rich context that you have provided and all the information. So you'll have to wait for the proceedings and for the special issue of the EFSA journal that will be issued at the end of the conference. But what I can do is to give you my takeaways from the morning. First of all, we got a really good list of suggested further readings, okay? So the thinking fast, thinking slow is top of the list, but you got loads of references and books that can get you into the mood for science communication and engagement with society. Second, I think we take away a little bit more awareness of our own cognitive limitations and of our own biases, although I have the suspicion that we will go away with a much better awareness of other people's biases rather than our own. And third, with this idea that we don't need more data, we need better data. And then I want my team to start taking notes because some of the recommendations that we will want to explore are how to measure the quality of communication and how we improve communication by being better at measuring the quality. And how do we provide better information, and what does quality mean? It's not just accuracy, clarity and timeliness, which is what we're trying to focus on in EFSA at the moment. And the third thing that I want my team to note down is how do we better cooperate with trustworthy institutions as senders and platforms, I'm quoting from some of the speakers today, of our materials, because there is a lot of good material that we publish. It gets a little bit stuck on our beautiful website. How do we make it travel further? How do we make it influence the views about science and food safety? And I've also heard that in this search for more data to have better quality information, there are some surveys like the Eurobarometer or other different formats of getting information from our audiences that we should be better at collating and, most importantly, better at using, because we're very good at collating information but not putting it into practice. So a lot of takeaways, a lot to add to our list of things to do. A big thank to all the colleagues within EFSA and outside EFSA that have really helped us shape this session, shape the afternoon session. And it's now time for the last poll of the morning, which will take us into the afternoon to inform the discussions that we will have there. Now, this is a challenge because in one word, we want to ask you what should be an essential element of any public engagement strategy. It doesn't work with hyphens. It doesn't work with very, very long strings of words. Please take a few moments to think of that single word that for you captures the essential element of public engagement strategy. I'd like the panel to think about it as well. I'm going to ask in a minute. I'm going to close the vote and see what the audience thinks. And I've just been informed, please turn it around, that EFSA 2018 hashtag is trending on Twitter alongside Ed Sheeran. So yeah, we're making it. So while we wait for the audience response to the poll, can I ask the panel, in one word, what does capture for you the essential element of public engagement? Shall we start with Ellen?
I have filled out feedback.
Thank you. Tracy? Early. Right. Trust? Listening? Relate? Openness? And trust. Beautiful words that we're going to take away. Is there a chance to have a look at what the audience thinks? Okay. Transparency, trust, honesty, listening, dialogue, participation, social media openness, humility, communication. A lot to work on. We're going to see whether the discussion in the afternoon is going to add or sort of amplify some of the words that came up from this morning's audience. I'd really like to thank all the panelists, speakers, co-chair, moderator, audience, organizers, supporters. It's been a fantastic morning, and we're going to break for lunch, come back at 13:45 sharply to continue on this theme and enjoy your lunch and networking.